Well, hello and welcome once again to Beat the Reset. My name is Tim and I am the guy in the hat. And today I wanted to talk to you about the petrodollar. What is really going on between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and is the petrodollar really over? We have seen a number of articles floating around social media and the internet saying that the petrodollar is finished. So let's start with what exactly is the petrodollar. First of all, it is not a specific currency. All the petrodollar is the US dollar, and oil exporting nations selling oil in US dollars. And the question is, how has this all come about? Are these oil exporting nations even required to sell oil in US dollars? Or can they sell oil in anything that they like? So let's go through it very quickly. Let's just quickly go through the history so you understand what has happened and ultimately, in the end, what is likely to happen to the US dollar as what we call the petrodollar. First of all, what we need to understand is that there's something called the world reserve currency. This is really where we need to start here. The world reserve currency is effectively the US dollar, which, of course, was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce at the Bretton Woods conference in the July of 1944. So it was 44 allied nations agreed that the US dollar should effectively become the world reserve standard. So in effect was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce at the wholesale level, because at that time it was actually illegal for the common man to trade gold. In fact, it had been illegal since the Gold Reserve Act of the January of 1934, and it would stay illegal for the common man to trade gold right up until the 1st of the 1st, 1975, when the unelected President Gerald Ford would repeal the Gold Reserve Act. Now, the United States dollar was pegged to gold at Bretton Woods in 1944. So in other words, the United States dollar was effectively on a gold standard. And what that meant is that the central banks around the world needed to essentially hold gold in reserve, especially the United States needed to hold gold in reserve in order to effectively limit the printing of the currency. So for every ounce of gold, it needed to be correlated with a certain amount of US dollars. But the problem, of course, is that in the United States, under the Federal Reserve System, is that the central bank has a thing called a printing press, and it switched it on and it forgot to turn it off. And largely they printed and printed and printed. This is the United States Federal Reserve. Their central bank printed currency for all sorts of reasons. Of course, there was a number of obviously overseas military operations that needed to be funded. I mean, not only did we have the Second World War, but of course, coming out of the Second World War, there were some major wars. 1950, there was the Korean War. Of course, there was also in 1963/64 the Vietnam War, and many other wars that needed to be funded. And of course, by the 1960s, the United States dollar was in a precarious situation. Britain, France, and Germany were largely more interested in having the gold in reserve than they were far more interested in holding the gold in reserve than they were in holding the US dollar, which was currently starting to lose enormous amounts of value through something called deficit spending and essentially quantitative easing and overprinting. And essentially, because there were a number of nations asking for gold, the United States, under, of course, Nixon, had to decide to take the radical move to end the Bretton Woods system. In other words, convertibility at the wholesale level of the US dollar to gold. So this was done on August 15th, 1971. Now, as soon as that happened, it meant that countries around the world, instead of trading unilaterally on the US dollar, which they'd done for 26 years since 1944, we are now looking at free-floating currencies. And, of course, this caused all sorts of issues for the United States dollar, its popularity as the world reserve currency. Could this cause the collapse of the world reserve currency? Well, of course, the United States was not in any hurry to see that happen. Now, some little-known facts that soon after leaving the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar was still trading at $35 an ounce for gold. The president at the time, Nixon, then in the December of 1971, debased the US dollar very quickly by altering the price of gold for the first time since it had been altered by Roosevelt in 1934. Nixon altered the price of the gold to $38 an ounce, so he increased it by $3, and this, of course, has a net effect of devaluing the currency by about 3 to 5%. Then in the in late 1973, in around about the August, Nixon again revalued gold under the Gold Reserve Act at $42.22 an ounce, thus debasing the US dollar yet again. And this all coincided with something called the oil embargo. Now, the oil embargo of 1973 is commonly termed the oil shock of 1973, and this was really in response to something called the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. And in that war, what we saw was Egypt and Syria essentially attacking Israel, and that was the claim, that they'd attacked Israel in an effort to take back territories that had been taken from Egypt and Syria in the Third Arab-Israeli War. So, of course, as the war raged, certain countries came to the defence of Israel. Now, this was really where the problem happened. And as a result of that, Saudi Arabia, who was one of the major oil suppliers in the region at the time, had decided to place trade embargoes, or oil embargoes, which is basically sanctioning, on any country that was in support of Israel during the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. Well, one of those countries, of course, was the United States, and they were essentially wrapped over the knuckles, if you like. And, of course, their economy, the United States economy, was in a whole world of trouble, not able to gain access to oil and so on through the Middle East. Also, the other problem is that the United States dollar was looking for a new home. Gold was no longer possible because the United States was no longer on the Bretton Woods Standard, so they were looking for a brand new home. Well, thanks to the Secretary of State at the time, which was Henry Kissinger, and Prince Fahd of Saudi Arabia in 1974, the United States basically went to Saudi Arabia and in an effort to do some kind of deal or agreement where the US dollar would retain its popularity by not pegging it to gold any longer, but to something that's far easier to peg to, which of course is oil. Now, it's not an oil-backed dollar per se, nor was there ever really any kind of formal agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States. Largely, the agreement is simply just a nod of a head and a handshake agreement, and it's something that we call a mutually beneficial arrangement. So there is no requirement for Saudi Arabia to do anything at all, in fact, nor is there any requirement for the US to do anything at all. However, the deal that was struck would enable military aid, of course, in the Middle East. So the Saudi Arabia could call on the biggest superpower in the world for its defences, and anybody that attempt to attack it, the US would stand, of course, like a sentry guard at a castle wall and prevent anybody or any nation from attacking Saudi Arabia. And in exchange for this, all the United States really wanted was to have the oil that was exported traded in US dollars. Now, of course, this gave the world reserve currency its wider appeal. Now, interestingly enough, through the oil embargo of 1973, just a year earlier, the reason the US were keen to do this is because oil jumped 300% to 400% from about $3 a barrel during the embargo to about $12 US a barrel. And of course, the US was keen to get in on this. Of course, because nations that were trading oil in US dollars were also buying US treasuries, in other words, buying US debt. So it was called what we call US dollar recycling. Now, in the 1975, just a year after Kissinger brokered this deal with Saudi Arabia, in 1975, the OPEC nations of the period were very, very quick to jump on board and start doing exactly the same, trading oil in US dollars. Now, of course, OPEC nations are the Organisation for Petroleum Exporting Countries. really had some of the most powerful oil nations in the world. In fact, today there are 12 OPEC members, and their oil fields, what we call their proven oil reserves, are 80% of all oil reserves in the world. And of course, the Middle East accounts for 67% of all OPEC reserves. So, of course, what we have now, and as we jump forward to 2024, and we go forward 50 years, is we now suddenly start to see why it's virtually impossible for the US dollar for oil to not be traded in US dollars, because 60% of all currencies around the world, in central bank currencies around the world, are US dollars. So in other words, the US dollar is held 60% in reserve. So this is against the euro, which is 20% in reserve. So of course the US dollar is a far easier currency to trade in, and far more desirable and much easier for nations to trade US dollars. You compare it to something like, say, for example, the Japanese yen and the pound, the British pound. Those two together are only 5% in reserve compared to the Chinese yuan/renminbi, which is 3% in reserve. So it's not really possible for oil to be traded by these big OPEC nations exported in yuan, unless, of course, they're dealing directly with China. And, of course, China's currency is controlled by the China Central Bank, the People's Bank of China. So there's a lot of intervention in the controlling of the value of the yuan/renminbi. So, of course, it's really interesting that the oil is still going to be sold in US dollars. Really no other alternative. And until we have another alternative, it means that all those stories that were floating around the internet and all those, people that were saying it's the end of the petrodollar, well, no, it isn't. It is not possible unless we find another trading mechanism. So that begs the question, what on earth could potentially be an alternative trading mechanism? Now, this is where we start to talk about the BRICS group, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which are the original 5 nations from 2009. It is now moved from 5 nations, of course, to 9. They've now added to the BRICS group Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, there were 2 more that had joined, and this is another myth, and I'm going to debunk this right here and now, is that the other 2 that joined were Argentina in early January 2024, but of course Javier Milei, who's the president, of course, was quick to reverse his decision. And of course Saudi Arabia never took up their position at the table. Now, this is very important people understand this. Saudi Arabia, contrary to what you hear and contrary to what a lot of commentators are saying, Saudi Arabia is not, and I repeat, is not a member of BRICS. However, they have made a very interesting move. Just recently, we saw the Bank for International Settlements project, mBridge, which is largely a cross-border central bank digital currency, which is being overseen by 5 central banks. We've seen Saudi Arabia join the project. Now, isn't that interesting? At a time when we're seeing a little bit of movement around the petrodollar and a little bit of indecisiveness around BRICS nations and what is going to be the BRICS nations trading currency. By the way, they don't have one yet. So US dollars, even though to become a member of BRICS, you have to denounce the US dollar. There is no real trading currency in the BRICS group. Now, Saudi Arabia is a very powerful member of BRICS, but they are not a member yet. They have the invitation, but they have not taken their position at the table. But what they have done is joined 5 central banks with this new central bank digital currency that is being proposed by the Bank for International Settlements, which could potentially see oil traded in something other than US dollars. So what an interesting move by Saudi Arabia. By the way, the 5 central banks that we see are the Central Bank of Thailand, we see the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia, and of course the People's Bank of China, together with the Bank for International Settlements Innovation Hub, starting to work on this incredible technology known as Project mBridge, or the mBridge ledger, which is largely going to be considered by the BRICS group as a means of cross-border payments. And we've already seen that the United Arab Emirates has successfully traded for the first time with China in a very, very interesting cross-border payment, which was about $300 million on a very fast cross-border transaction using the mBridge technology. So I guess the question really is this Saudi Arabia's big move away from the US dollar? Are they building another fortress whilst still trading in US dollars cleverly, and not joining the BRICS group means that they don't have to denounce the US dollar just yet, and that they can join the Project mBridge and the BRICS, the nations. And interestingly enough, of the 5 central banks that are involved in Project mBridge, and this is really the big breaking news, is that they're all either BRICS nations or applying to be BRICS nations. So this is a fascinating power shift. As I said, all completely the brainchild of the Bank for International Settlements, which is, of course, the most powerful of the central banks based in Basel, Switzerland, Mexico, and, of course, Hong Kong. So that's it for me. Of course, the guy in the hat just debunking the theory that the petrodollar is all over. Of course, it is not all over by 100 miles, and won't be over until we find an alternative currency and a way to trade oil in another currency. So that's it for me, the guy in the hat. Hope you enjoyed this very, very short podcast today. These are all 15 minutes in length, roughly thereabouts, so that you can consume them easily while you're driving in your car. In the meantime, I hope you are well. I hope you're looking after your health. I hope you're looking after your families. It's very, very important. And as always, make good choices.